himself, one of the leading contenders in the leadership race. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Do or die, and it might be die, mightn't it?
Well, I think the real greatest risk is if we don't get some finality and get out of the EU by October. And that's why it's important to provide this finality that Boris has and which Jeremy Hunt, I'm afraid, has not. And I think
he says it's a fake deadline.
He does, and it's very interesting. So if it's a fake deadline, for how long precisely would he keep us in this paralysing uncertainty of the haggle on Brexit? And if he's willing to accept another extension, would he accept conditions as the EU has talked about, for example, a general election or a second referendum? I think those are some quite important questions that need to be answered.
The trouble is that Mr Johnson seems to be inhabiting a bit of a fantasy world, doesn't he? Because he believes that he is going to get, just by being Boris Johnson, apparently, he's going to get Europe to agree to all sorts of things that Europe have said absolutely no to, like rewriting the withdrawal agreement.
Well, the crucial difference, I think, in all of this is giving that categoric assurance we're out by the end of October, which wasn't given before, in which, of course, Jeremy Hunt was part of the cabinet who decided to take no deal off the table and to allow another extension. By refusing to do that, Boris has given us the best shot of getting a deal that would be acceptable. But in any event, he's giving the finality, the certainty that come the end of October, this pantomime around Brexit will be over. And that's important. We've got to be able to move on and get out of this rut.
So let's assume then that it was looking round about the 20th of October, just pick a date out of the hat, and it was looking sort of reasonably possible that we might get something that might help us to get a deal, blah, 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 but it couldn't be done by the 31st of October. It wouldn't matter. He'd say, out on the 31st, that's it, stuff the rest. Well, that's my language, not his. Of course, he wouldn't say such a thing. But forget it. Now we're out. If you can't do it by 31st, we're out. Come what may.
Well, this is the crucial lesson of the last 3 years, and indeed my experience as a negotiator in the Foreign Office and as Brexit Secretary. The minute you start flirting with an extension, you undermine your negotiating leverage. You eviscerate your negotiating strength because the EU, of course, has got every reason to delay. That is what is so important about the assurance that Boris has given, and what is so important about frankly, the weakness that has been telegraphed by Jeremy in relation to this. There's a certain naivety in negotiating terms of saying, well, actually, yes, we'd be open to an extension. That, of course, invites the EU to double down. What Boris is doing for those that want a deal is giving us the best shot at achieving it.
Except that you have to look at the reality. You have to look at the calendar. We won't have a new Prime Minister until July the 23rd. There will be 100 days between July the 23rd and October the 31st. But you've got to factor in the summer recess in this country, much of Europe shutting down in August, the election of the European Commission, then the party conference season here, and so on and so on and so on. And the idea that we could have some sort of new deal that would be ratified by the British Parliament by the 31st of October is, I repeat the word I used, it's fantasy, isn't it?
No, and in fact, I became Brexit Secretary during my 5 months in the job.
And you saw how difficult it was.
And around July, and there was absolutely nothing stopping us working over the summer right the way through. So I don't really buy these sort of self-imposed bureaucratic restraints put on by the EU. And of course, they're the ones that...
Holiday is not a bureaucratic restraint.
Oh, I think taking the whole...
You suggested we don't take a holiday. You lot don't take a holiday.
I didn't take a holiday, and frankly, I don't think...
So no parliamentary recess?
Well, as an MP, but not as a Secretary of State. In fact, I worked right the way through. And of course, it was one of the EU's complaints that I was out in Brussels every week. But the point I'm just making is this is a self-imposed restraint applied by the EU. There is nothing stopping us from getting a deal by October if there's the political will. And I think, frankly, all of this pushback that we're getting from the EU, let's see whether it survives once we've got a Prime Minister in place. But frankly, if we end up on WTO terms, it will be the EU's choice.
Well, now, end up on WTO terms. Let's have a look at that. Liam Fox says, incidentally, who is, of course, the Trade Secretary himself, a no-deal scenario, by definition, suggests that there would be no mutual agreement between the UK and the EU on any temporary or permanent arrangements. In those circumstances, Article 24 of the WTO cannot be used.
Well, I don't think that's quite correct as a legal matter, but it's certainly true to say. It's certainly. Well, let me give you my view as a former Foreign Office lawyer as well as former Brexit Secretary. I think that if we end up without the principal deal that has been being negotiated, with the separation aspect and the political declaration on the future relationship, there would still be this option of what's called a standstill arrangement under Article 24 of GATT. Now, it's perfect. No, but it's
not according to the Governor of the Bank of England.
No, with the greatest respect, he's a central banker. He's not a diplomat.
The Secretary's got it wrong. The Governor of the Bank of England's got it wrong. Europe's got it wrong.
Well, let me put it to you, John. Let me finish to give you the answer. The point is, legally, it could be done. The question is whether there's the political will, which is why we come back to the same point as before. Ultimately, if the EU wants to just throw up its hands and say we're not going to budge, we will refuse all reasonable compromise and we end up on WTO terms, it will be a decision made by the EU. And I think Boris is right to say we'll go back, we'll continue to keep the arm of friendship extended, but ultimately we must give businesses in this country and the people of this country the finality that will be out by the end of October. And I think Jeremy needs to look very carefully if he's not willing to provide that assurance, what it means in practice. It means more paralysing uncertainty with all the economic and political costs that come with it.
Well, except that that at least we wouldn't be leaving without a deal of any sort. And again, to go back to Liam Fox, you say the agreement of the EU. I mean, why should the EU say to a country that's voted to leave the EU, has agreed, whose Prime Minister has agreed to a deal with them, but whose Parliament has thrown out that deal, now wants something completely different? Why should they bend over backwards to give us exactly what they want? Because it's no benefit to them to do it.
Well, first of all, I think reasonable compromise and mutual self-interest is always in both sides' interests. And secondly, I think that the damage to the EU, to the Republic of Ireland, but also the continental economy of having a WTO Brexit, I think would be significant. I think there are risks all round. And also, of course, we would retain the £39 billion, or at least the lion's share of it. And so I think there are all sorts of downsides to the EU. But ultimately, I accept it's their choice. What I think Boris is quite right to say is that he will make reasonable attempts to try and bridge the gap. If the EU are utterly unwilling to move in the way you've described, then it will, of course, be partly their choice. And I think that's important.
Right. And then Parliament says, we are not leaving without a no deal, without a deal.
Well, if there is a motion passed by MPs which
there will be,
which says it will have zero legal effect. The default position in legislation, as we've discussed before.
And then there is a motion of no confidence in the government, which would be supported by people like Ken Clarke.
Well, I think, as we saw earlier on your show, people like Rory Stewart on top of Tobias Ellwood were backing away from that and saying, of course, they won't vote in a vote of no confidence to see Jeremy Corbyn become Prime Minister. I think the number will be vanishingly few that would actually be willing to countenance such a damaging step. And of course, the biggest risk in all of this is that we don't we don't get Brexit done and dusted. We continue the paralysing uncertainty. And I think the risk of a Jeremy Corbyn government is far greater if we carry on with this tortuous, paralysing uncertainty.
But there is a very, very, very strong chance that we would be facing an election. Is that preferable than saying, well, look, 31st, we'd love to be out by the 31st, but if it being a bit of a delay, are you absolutely saying this morning that, and is Boris Johnson saying, that I would rather have an election based, presumably then, there'd be only one issue at the election, do we get out or not? I'd rather have an election than just delay a wee bit longer, maybe, honestly.
I think the greatest risk, and there are risks on all sides, the greatest risk that we face right now is to continue this uncertainty, which has had a debilitating effect, I think, economically, but also in terms of trust in our democracy, and certainly for the Conservatives, it's having a debilitating effect. So I think that the most important thing is to bring this to some kind of finality. And Boris is absolutely...
Even if it means a disastrous effect on our economy.
I don't accept that it would be disastrous. But the real question for those that want to dangle a further extension based on the experience of the last 3 years, and this is the question for Jeremy Hunt, if he thinks that October is a fake deadline, is how long will this paralysis go on for, and what conditions would you accept for an extension? Would you, for example, the EU has talked about saying we'd only have an extension if there's a second referendum, that it would be an extension to give effect to. Is that what Jeremy Hunt is accepting? So I think there are all sorts of questions on all sides, but the biggest risk right now is that we don't get the finality and the certainty that businesses need and that I think voters need for trust in our democracy.
Dominic Raab, many thanks.